Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today's video is my January wrap-up, and as far as reading goes, January was a bit of a mixed bag. There were a couple of books that I really loved, a couple of books that I really disliked, and a couple of books that were kind of fair to middling in my opinion. So we're going to talk about all of those, and just up front, I'm going to say that there are two potentially spicy reviews coming of popular books, and if one of those books happens to be a favorite of yours, just know that I wish they were favorites of mine too. I'm suffering from serious FOMO on both accounts. But why don't we just dive right in? The first book that I want to talk about is Sealskin by Su Bristow, and I really liked the idea of this book from the beginning. It's set in a remote seafaring village in Scotland, and it's based on the myth of the Selkie, which is this creature that is essentially part seal and part woman. They live in the ocean as seals basically the entire year, but one night they can come ashore, remove their seal skins, and frolic about as beautiful naked women. And so the book starts with that scene of these Selkies coming ashore and romping in the moonlight. But within 10 pages, there was a rape scene. And I did not like how the rape was handled over the course of the book. First of all, I had issues with the actual scene itself, because Donald is described as having never seen a naked woman before, and he happens to get one of these Selkies alone and basically forces himself on her, and they describe him as coming back to himself, like he's temporarily lost his wits, and so this is what he does as a result, which put a bad taste in my mouth. But then he brings this Selkie home to his mother, and she realizes what he's done and is completely unbothered by the fact that her son has violated this woman. In fact, what she's most concerned with is the fact that this Selkie might now be pregnant and carrying her grandchild, because apparently the Selkies only come ashore when they're looking for a mate because they're in heat, or at least that's what she describes. And also an aside on Bridie, his mother, she's also completely unfazed by the fact that this woman is a Selkie. Like, completely unfazed. It doesn't even bother her. It's as if you'd said, oh, she's a blonde, which was weird, admittedly. But I digress. Anyway, so they don't really address the violence throughout the book, and they try to redeem Donald, the rapist, by basically saying that he falls in love with Mariah, which is the name they give the Selkie, and that he wants to make a proper home for her and their family. And beyond that, they really don't address anything that he's done. So I had a lot of issues with that, as you can tell. As far as the rest of the book goes, I liked the fact that you could really get a sense of the atmosphere of this remote seafaring village, this small community of fishermen and their wives. That was really well done, but I would have to say that the sense of place and time was not as explicit as I would have hoped. In fact, I don't know that you could necessarily pinpoint that it was Scotland by just reading the book if you hadn't read the synopsis, and I don't know that you could actually pinpoint a time period in which this book was taking place either. All you really understand is that it is some fishing village somewhere far removed from most of society, and that's it. So I would have liked the Scottishness of it and the time period to feel a little bit more prominent, because it just wasn't there for me. But in all honesty, I think the thing that made this book as interesting as it was Mariah, the Selkie, because she is kind of this enigma. She's not a character who ever speaks, but it is so interesting to see her learning how to live among the humans, and also seeing how she interacts with other people, especially young children and women and also really aggressive males. So that was all really, really interesting to see, and you don't really ever get a fully fleshed out version of her because she is meant to be so much of a mystery, but I did enjoy reading about her interactions with the other people in the village. At the end of the day, I did give this 3 stars. The way that the sexual violence was handled kind of knocked off a star or 2 in my opinion. It was an interesting read, but I don't necessarily know that I would read it again. So the next book is gonna get a little bit spicy, and people might hate me. But the book is Pachenko by Min Jin Lee, which I went into with very high expectations. I think that I've only ever heard rave reviews of this book, and to be honest, considering the genre, considering the subject matter, I was like, this is a no-brainer for me. I'm going to love this book. It's going to be 5 stars. It's going to end up on my best of 2021 in December. And as you might have seen in my vlog, that was not the case. This was actually a really disappointing read for me. There were a couple reasons for it, I think. The first is that I had difficulty connecting with the characters. So this is a multi-generational story of this Korean family who are living first in Korea when it's occupied by the Japanese, and then in Japan. And the book itself is divided into 3 smaller book sections. So in book 1, I felt that the characters were very, very distant. And I thought that that was getting better in book 2 because I was actually able to shed one of those like cinematic single tears down the cheek at a particularly sad moment. So I was like, okay, I'm starting to feel invested in these characters. And then book 3 happens, and I knew something was amiss because someone dies, and I had 0 reaction to it. Like, just turn the page, no shock, no awe, no sadness, and that's coming from someone who literally cries while watching some commercials. So I knew something wasn't working for me here. So that kind of threw me a little bit. And then also I had issues with the pacing. The book covers a really big chunk of time, so understandably you're going to have time jumps, but the time jumps in this were done in such a way that it felt like it was happening all the time, especially once you hit book 2 and book 3, and they were really jarring. And in order to, I think, compensate for these time jumps or time leaps, as the case may be, there was a lot of telling and not showing, which to me feels a little bit lazy in storytelling, where essentially you would have these moments that felt like a previously on Pachenko, and it would tell you all the things that you needed to know really, really quickly, and then kind of plop you into the moment that the story is supposed to be picked up from. And it was not a great reading experience for me because of that. Also, I was surprised at how explicit this book was when it came to sex, because the prose itself, there's no doubt that it's beautiful, but it's this sort of historical fiction that I was almost anticipating, kind of like flowery purple prose-y type stuff. Oh no, this gets downright anatomical, and that was just weird in this book for me. Like, I'm not squeamish, I'm not a prude, but I was like, oh, it was weird. So just keep that in mind. As I said, there's no doubt that the prose in this is really stunning, and to be honest, I think that the thing that this book does so well is actually provide this cultural context and history that I don't think anyone else, or at least that I know of, has done. The way that it weaves a story of the relationship between the Japanese and the Korean during this time period, and the racism of the Japanese towards the Korean, and everything that kind of stems from that, was so fascinating, and as a history nerd, I loved everything about how that is laid out for you. So that was the part of the book that I think made it wow. But otherwise, it just kind of fell flat for me at the end of the day. So I ended up giving it 3 stars. I did listen to this as an audiobook and it was long. It didn't do it for me, and I think that was probably my biggest disappointment of the month. The next book that I want to talk about is The 3 Escapes of Hannah Arendt by Ken Krimstein, which is a graphic novel. Actually, my sister got this for me for my birthday, and I'm just going to put it out there. I don't know if I can do a proper review of a graphic novel because it's not a genre or a format that I'm super familiar with. In fact, I've tried a few graphic novels in the past and they've been misses for me. I just didn't understand the appeal. However, I really enjoyed this one, and I think part of it is because I was genuinely already interested in the subject matter of the book itself. And if you don't know, I am trying to convince myself to pick up The Origins of Totalitarianism again and finish it in 2021. I am currently 1/3 of the way through it from last year and still have not touched it. But so I'm interested in Hannah Arendt and kind of have ulterior motives. I learned so much from this book though, about her life that I didn't already know. I think it did a really good job of explaining where she came from, how she ended up being this brilliant mind when it comes to 20th century philosophy and political philosophy in particular. Hearing about her escapes from the Nazis, really impressive and really interesting, and it just did a great job at creating this groundwork to become more familiar with her as an individual and not just as this kind of omnipotent author of this vast book on totalitarianism. So I thought it was really interesting in that regard. I also really loved how you got to see who in this circle of 20th century intellectuals she interacted with and got to learn a little bit about what they stood for, what they thought, and how that all kind of wove together at this particular moment in the 20th century, which largely has to do with the Nazis in Germany and World War II. So it was just really, really interesting. Again, I don't know that I am a particularly good reviewer of graphic novels, but that's kind of what the drawings look like. I still don't know if I am a fan of graphic novels because to me I still focused heavily on the words and the story that was being told that way rather than on the artwork, which is the main point of a graphic novel. But I did enjoy this one, and so I did give it 4 stars. Highly recommend it if you're looking for a biography or nonfiction or anything like that. This made it really digestible, and Hannah Arendt is not digestible typically, so really good way to introduce yourself to this brilliant woman. So we're gonna get salty again, and I feel like people are gonna throw tomatoes at me. But we're gonna talk about The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I nearly DNF'd this multiple times. I had such an unpleasant experience reading it. I honestly don't know where to begin. Basically, this book is about a woman from the 1700s who makes a deal with the devil, and the devil is a trickster, obviously, and to get what she wants, he makes her someone that no one can remember and that will never leave a trace. And so you fast forward 300 years and someone, a man, finally remembers her. Fine. Okay. What I found most offensive about this book was that it could be characterized as historical fiction. The fact of the matter is that the sections that were set in the past were so lazily done. Like, no research, nothing, in order to actually create some sort of world-building experience, which is just as important in historical fiction as it is in fantasy or sci-fi, in my opinion. Like, not even bare minimum level of research was done. Addie LaRue could have been in any pastoral village in any country in Europe, basically at any time over the last 300 years. So it wasn't great, in my opinion, and it was just lazy. If the book had stayed more in the present, I think I might have enjoyed it a little bit more, because I didn't have issues necessarily with those parts of the story. It was just anytime it went to the past, I basically rolled my eyes and was just annoyed. Honestly, I just didn't feel wowed by anything about the book itself either. There were moments when I thought V.E. Schwab's writing had like this spark of something interesting, but overall I just thought it was okay. Nothing to write home about. I didn't think it was necessarily all that original. In fact, A Faustian Bargain is a very, very old and well-loved trope, so I didn't think that was necessarily all that interesting or innovative either. And on top of that, the most interesting character in the book for me was the devil, Luke, who, to be honest, if this story had been written from his perspective, I probably would have thoroughly enjoyed it, because he was just captivating, as you would expect any devil character to be. But I'm not saying V.E. Schwab should go all Midnight Sun and rewrite this book from his perspective. Like, please don't. It was just probably 100 pages too long, really repetitive. I don't know how many times we had to hear about the anniversary of her deal with Luke, but I could have done with probably half of them. But at the end of the day, I gave this book 2 stars or so. Yeah. Whew, okay. I'm like, that one made me a little sweaty and clammy, and don't hate me, but the next book that we're gonna talk about is one that I actually really, really loved. Zarina by Ellen Alpsten. I think I've been saying Alpstein, but I think it might be Alpsten. And I loved this book. It was 5 stars and then some, in my opinion. I loved it so much that I drew out the reading experience. Like, I would only read it in small sections so that the book wouldn't end. And then I was so upset when it did end. I loved it. It is the novelization of Catherine I of Russia. She is the second wife of Peter the Great, and she's kind of, as the book says, the most powerful woman history ever forgot. She kind of takes a back seat to Catherine the Great when you think of Tsarinas of Russia, but she is such an interesting character. She is born a Polish peasant and eventually becomes Peter the Great's mistress, his wife, and then the ruler of Russia. And this book starts from when she's a young girl and she is that Polish peasant, Marta, and goes up until her death. This book, unlike Addie LaRue, was so well researched and handled history in such a wonderfully engaging way, in my opinion. The Petrine era of Russia is one that has been covered backwards and forwards, but I feel like this book does it justice. You get a sense of the westernization and modernization of Russia and the different conflicts, the wars with the Ottoman Empire, the wars with the Swedes, the wars, kind of weird relations with the other European rulers who look down on the Russians themselves, and you see Katherine in the midst of all of this, and she's just this force. She's really the only person who can handle Peter the Great, and I think her character is also just so complex in a lot of ways, because she is this character that becomes very respected by a number of people. She handles Peter like no one else, but at the same time she has insecurities about certain things. I mean, she's always concerned about Peter passing her over for a younger woman like he did his first wife, who he sent off to a convent. She's always worried about whether or not she'll be able to give him a healthy son. She has 12 children for him, and I think it's interesting to see their relationship, because at moments it does feel perfectly matched. Like, they feel very well suited for each other. That part was really interesting, but at the same time there's this moment in the book where Peter the Great's violent and erratic behavior makes her question her feelings for him, and you kind of see her having to disassociate. So being in love with her husband and this man who's done so much for her, but also being horrified by the monstrous things that he has done. And so it's very interesting to see kind of her emotional and mental state and her feelings for Peter over the course of this book. I would say that this reads a lot like what you would expect an HBO TV show to read like, and that's not a diss, because I do think that HBO has done some fabulous period genres, two of which star Helen Mirren, who I adore, but they do them really well. But it does have that sex and violence and debauchery and everything that you would expect in an HBO show in this. It doesn't necessarily bother me. There is definitely sexual violence. There are passages where they're talking about people being tortured. There's war and violence and all sorts of courtly debauchery. So just bear that in mind. If that's not your cup of tea, or if that bothers you, this wouldn't necessarily be the book for you. But I absolutely loved it. I thought the writing was exquisite. As I said, it was just so beautifully researched, made me fall in love with the character of Katherine the First, to the point that I'm so excited to read about her when I read my history of the Romanovs. And I'm just so sad that this is the author's first book, and so I can't stock a backlist. Loved this book. If you're into Russian history, highly recommend it. There you go. I gave it 5 stars, as I said, I think at the beginning of all of this. So yeah, that's my take on this one. The last book is Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq, which is a memoir of an Inuit woman living in the Arctic during, I think, the 1970s. And the writing in this is stunning, but it's definitely not a book for everyone. Like, this book is bleak. It deals with some really uncomfortable stuff. It is a mix of poetry and illustrations and more traditional chapters, but the story itself makes it very difficult at times to be able to parse out what is happening in real life and what is happening kind of in this spiritual or even maybe a fugue state for the character. And a lot of times when you're in this more spiritual realm and addressing that side of the story, it gets really grotesque and sexually violent. So yeah, I was not prepared for that, but that kind of is a recurring theme. That was interesting, but also really difficult to stomach. But as I said, the writing is beautiful. It was really interesting to hear more about the spirituality, which in addition to being very kind of violent and grim, also has a lot to do with nature, as one might expect with these peoples who are living in this very remote climate and have these very ancient traditions. And it does talk about some of how that tradition is being lost. In some cases they're trying to preserve things like the language. So all of that made for a really fascinating read. It is not a long book. It's definitely not going to be everyone's cup of tea. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and that's just because parts of this were not necessarily good fits for me. I'm not someone who reads a lot of poetry or particularly enjoys it, but I do love the writing and prose in this, like top shelf type prose. It was just wow. Those are my thoughts on it. If you're not too squeamish, if you're genuinely interested, I would certainly say go for it. So yeah, those were all the books that I read in January. I am currently reading Smitten. I just haven't gotten far enough along in my reread to include it in this, so you'll see it in February. But I was actually technically taking part in 2 readathons, which I don't think I mentioned in my intro. I was taking part in the 12 Days of BOOKMAS, which went into the first week of January, and also the month-long Bookworm's New Year's readathon. I actually did fairly well with it. I think the only book that I did not get to on my TBR was All the Light We Cannot See, which, to be honest, at this point I don't know that I ever will, so I might just need to suck it up and unhaul that book. But yeah, otherwise, can't say I did too bad with those readathons. As always, thank you so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, and I would love to know what your favorite read from January was, so be sure to leave that in the comments too. I'll talk to you later. Bye!